The map looked like a miracle. A band of colour stretched across England, crossed the Channel, swallowed Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and reached down through Aquitaine toward the Pyrenees. On parchment, it seemed as if one family had wrapped its hand around the throat of Western Europe. At the centre of that world stood Henry II. He was King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, lord over lands that made the King of France look smaller than his title. By 1154, when Henry took the English crown, the political balance of Europe had shifted so violently that no army had needed to win a single decisive battle to announce it. Marriage had done part of the work, inheritance had done the rest. And that was the first warning. Because the Angevin Empire was not built like Rome. It had no single capital that made every road bend towards it. No shared imperial law reached evenly from London to Poitiers. No single language, no single court culture, no single political identity held the whole structure together. It was a family possession, and family possessions are dangerous things. They can be inherited, they can be divided, they can be claimed by brothers, sons, wives, nephews, rivals, and kings who wait patiently across the border with a lawyer's memory and a soldier's appetite. What is an empire if every province obeys for a different reason? That question would haunt the Angevins from the beginning. It would follow Henry II through palace halls and courtrooms. It would follow Eleanor of Aquitaine through marriage, rebellion, and confinement. It would follow Richard the Lionheart across crusading seas and castle walls. And finally, it would sit beside King John at Runnymede in 1215, when a ruler who had inherited the largest dynastic system in Western Europe was forced to place his seal on a charter limiting his own power. But that ending did not begin with weakness. It began with success. Henry II inherited a broken England after nearly 2 decades of civil war. He received Normandy through family right. He held Anjou, Maine, and Touraine from the Angevin patrimony. Then, in 1152, he married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable women in medieval Europe. And with her came a duchy so vast and rich that it transformed him from a dangerous prince into a continental threat. A wedding changed the map. Somewhere in the Lord's Hall in Aquitaine, a man who had once owed political attention to the French king now had to calculate the meaning of a new master. The banners had changed above him, but the roads were the same. The vineyards were the same. The tolls, castles, rival families, local customs and old resentments remained where they had always been. This was how medieval power often worked. A decision made by 2 aristocrats could move an entire region into a new political orbit. But obedience did not travel as quickly as a marriage contract. It had to be negotiated, enforced, paid for, and repeated. Henry understood that better than most rulers of his age. He was not simply a collector of titles. He was a man of movement. He crossed water, rode through weather, appeared in courts, inspected castles, pressured barons, corrected officials, and forced the machinery of rule to feel his presence. In England, he strengthened royal justice. In his continental lands, he relied on lordship, personal command, and the difficult art of making proud men believe that disobedience would cost them more than loyalty. For a while, it worked. From England, Henry could draw money and administrative strength. From Normandy, he controlled one of the richest and most strategically vital duchies in France. From Anjou came the family identity that gave the empire its name. From Aquitaine came scale, prestige, and danger. The danger mattered. Aquitaine was not a quiet dowry. It was old, proud, regional, difficult, and attached to Eleanor in ways no husband could fully erase. Normandy had its own aristocracy. England had its sheriffs, courts, and memories of civil war. Anjou had its family roots. Brittany, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland each belonged to the Angevin world in different degrees, under different pressures. On a map, it was one colour. In reality, it was many bargains. A royal clerk in Winchester might have seen the truth more clearly than a court poet. Imagine him late at night, bent over a table, copying orders by candlelight. The ink darkens his fingers. Wax softens near the flame. Somewhere nearby, a chest waits for coin that will be demanded from men who have never seen Aquitaine, never walked the Norman frontier, never cared which castle guarded the Seine. The order is written in England. The cost belongs elsewhere. That was the genius and the weakness of the Angevin system. England could help fund continental ambition. Continental prestige could strengthen royal authority. Victories in one region could intimidate another. A castle on the Seine, a court in Westminster, a marriage in Poitiers, and a rebellion in Brittany were not separate stories. They were all threads in the same family net. But a net is not a wall. Henry's power depended on movement, personality, fear, law, and the ability to make competing territories accept one ruler's priorities. It depended on a king strong enough to keep barons uncertain, sons waiting, bishops cautious, and enemies guessing. No parchment could guarantee that after him. The French king understood this slowly, then very well. In the early years, the Capetian monarchy looked smaller than the Plantagenet dominion. The King of France was, in theory, overlord of several lands held by Henry. But theory has a way of becoming a weapon when patience sharpens it. The Plantagenet kings were sovereign in England. In France, they were also vassals. That contradiction was not decorative, it was fatal. Henry could be a king on one side of the Channel and a duke or count owing obligations on the other. The same man could wear a crown and still be summoned under feudal law. The same family could look imperial to an English observer and legally vulnerable to a French one. What seemed like grandeur from London could look like a case file in Paris. And then came the bloodline. Henry had sons. That should have been a blessing. In dynastic politics, children meant continuity. Sons meant future security. A ruler without heirs invited chaos. But too many ambitious heirs could create a different kind of chaos. Henry the young king wanted more than ceremonial honor. Richard wanted Aquitaine and the authority to rule it. Geoffrey had his place in the family's political geometry. John, the youngest, would eventually inherit more suspicion than love. Above them stood Eleanor, queen, duchess, mother, political force, never merely an ornament in Henry's story. The empire had been assembled through family. It would be tested by family. Every title created an expectation. Every expectation created resentment. Every son who received too little became a possible rebel. Every son who received enough became a possible rival. This was the private danger inside the public triumph. Henry could defeat enemies beyond his borders, but he could not make inheritance simple. He could build courts, restore order, discipline nobles, humble rivals, and bend large parts of Western Europe around his will. But he could not escape the oldest problem of dynastic power. What happens when the ruler's own children begin to see patience as humiliation? By the time King John stood at Runnymede in 1215, the answer had become visible in ink and wax. The Angevin dream had already lost Normandy. The continental inheritance had been shattered by Philip II of France. English barons, tired of paying for failed wars and royal demands, forced John into a political humiliation that would echo far beyond its immediate crisis. Magna Carta was not born as modern democracy. It was born from anger, fear, privilege, debt, and a king whose authority had lost too much trust. Still, the image endures. A meadow beside the Thames, a king under pressure. A seal pressed into parchment. The man at Runnymede was not Henry II. He did not possess Henry's force of personality, Richard's battlefield fame, or Eleanor's political aura. But he did inherit their world. More precisely, he inherited the bill for it. That is why the Angevin Empire cannot be understood as a simple rise and fall. It was not just built by strong rulers and ruined by a weak one. That version is too easy. It lets the system escape judgment. The deeper story is colder. Henry II created something extraordinary because he knew how to turn inheritance into command. But the same mechanism that made his power possible also made it unstable. Lands gained by marriage could carry old loyalties. Lands held by feudal right could be challenged by feudal law. Sons raised inside a culture of inheritance could demand their share before the father was ready to surrender it. The empire did not collapse because one map was badly drawn. It collapsed because the map believed a family could remain one will forever. Before we move deeper into the first great transformation of this story, remember this. Ruins are not where history begins. History begins when a decision looks brilliant, practical, even necessary, and quietly creates a future crisis no one is ready to name. If you want more stories like this, where power is examined not as legend but as a living system, subscribe and follow the next chapter. Because before Henry II could build his vast dominion, England itself had to be broken. And in the smoke of that broken kingdom, during the long violence of the anarchy, a young prince learned the lesson that would define his life. Order is never given freely. It has to be taken. Before Henry II became the man who ruled from England to Aquitaine, he was the child of a broken promise. The promise had been made by Henry I. The old King of England had spent years trying to secure the future after tragedy struck his bloodline. In 1120, the White Ship sank off the coast of Normandy, taking with it his only legitimate son, William Adelin. One night at sea turned succession from a plan into a wound. The royal future, which had once looked simple, became dangerously open. So Henry I did what strong kings often do when the future refuses to obey them. He tried to force certainty onto it. His daughter Matilda had imperial dignity from her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. She was not an ordinary princess. She had seen courts, ceremony, diplomacy, and the cold architecture of continental power. Henry I made his magnates swear to recognize her as his heir. On parchment, it looked settled, but oaths are strongest when fear stands behind them. And when Henry I died in 1135, fear moved faster than loyalty. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, crossed quickly to England and seized the crown. He had blood connection, noble support, speed, and the advantage that medieval politics often gave to the man already sitting on the throne. Matilda had the claim. Stephen had the moment. England paid for the difference. What followed would later be remembered as the Anarchy, a civil war that did not simply divide a court, but damaged the habits of obedience that make kingship possible. From 1135 onward, castles rose without permission. Local lords hardened themselves behind walls. Allegiance shifted according to survival. Royal authority, once feared, became negotiable. That was the real disaster. Civil war does not only kill soldiers. It teaches everyone that power can be contested. A village near one of the unauthorized castles might not have cared which claimant had the better blood right. To the people below, politics arrived as hoofbeats, smoke, and demands. A reeve might stand in a muddy yard while armed men asked for grain in the name of King Stephen. Weeks later, another company might arrive claiming loyalty to Empress Matilda. The same sacks of barley could not feed two causes. The same field could not be harvested twice. The same family could not give a son to every banner that passed through. This is where legitimacy becomes physical. Not in a coronation hall, in a barn with too little grain. Stephen was not an empty figure. He had courage. He could be generous, personally appealing, and brave in battle. But generosity can become weakness when too many powerful men learn they can bargain with the crown. His reign became a test of whether a king could remain king while giving away pieces of the authority that made kingship matter. Matilda, meanwhile, was formidable but politically constrained. She had the stronger legal claim from Henry I's arrangements, but she faced a world uncomfortable with female rule, suspicious of her imperial style, and unwilling to submit easily after Stephen had already taken the crown. Her supporters could win ground. They could not easily make the whole realm obey. The war became less a clean contest between right and wrong than a long demonstration of fragmentation. In 1141, Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln. For a moment, Matilda seemed close to victory, but victory in medieval politics had to be performed as well as achieved. She needed recognition, ceremony, obedience, and acceptance from London. Instead, resistance hardened, her position weakened. Stephen was eventually released after Matilda's half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, was captured. The wheel turned again. No one was strong enough to end the conflict cleanly, and as the years passed, England learned the habits of disorder. Castles became private centres of force. Sheriffs could not always impose royal will. Barons played one claimant against another. Roads became less safe. Law became more local, more personal, more dependent on who controlled the nearest wall. Imagine a merchant trying to move cloth through this world. At dawn, he loads his pack animals beneath a grey sky. The road is wet. Iron shoes strike stone and mud. He carries coin, wool, and fear. At one crossing, a local lord demands payment. At another, men in a different allegiance demand it again. A seal that meant protection last month may mean nothing this month. The king's peace has become a rumour, repeated by people who remember it more clearly than they experience it. That was the inheritance waiting for Henry. Not only a crown, a damaged idea of authority. Henry was the son of Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou. Through his mother, he carried the claim of Henry I. Through his father, he carried Angevin ambition and continental resources. He grew up not as a prince sheltered from political violence, but as a claimant shaped by it. His future was built inside a lesson repeated again and again. If royal authority hesitates, private power fills the space. This lesson would become the spine of his rule. Henry did not invent royal government, and he did not restore order by magic, but he understood the emotional memory of civil war. He knew that after years of disputed kingship, the crown had to become frightening again, not randomly cruel, but dependable, present, and difficult to ignore. By the early 1150s, Stephen was exhausted. Matilda's direct campaign had faded, and Henry had become the serious future around which settlement could form. In 1153, the Treaty of Wallingford recognized Stephen as king for life, while naming Henry as his heir. It was not a triumphal conquest. It was something more politically useful, a way for exhausted men to stop bleeding without admitting complete defeat. The treaty mattered because it did what war had failed to do. It made succession believable again. When Stephen died in 1154, Henry crossed into kingship not as a romantic savior, but as the answer to a problem everyone had grown tired of living inside. His coronation did not simply place a crown on a young man's head. It announced that the long argument over England's future was over. At least officially. But official endings rarely erase the habits created by violence. Henry inherited castles that needed control, nobles who had learned the taste of autonomy, local jurisdictions that had grown thick during weakness, and a political class that had spent years watching royal authority become conditional. If he wanted to rule, he had to do more than claim descent from Henry I. He had to reverse the psychology of the anarchy. He had to make men believe that the crown had returned as a force. This is why Henry's later obsession with law, order, revenue, and royal justice cannot be understood as mere administrative tidiness. It was political memory hardened into policy. Every unauthorized castle reminded him of what happened when local power escaped control. Every evasive baron carried the smell of civil war. Every gap in royal authority looked like the beginning of another Stephen and Matilda. For Henry, order was not gentle. Order was survival. And that made him dangerous. He came to the throne young, energetic, impatient, and already tied to a continental world far larger than England alone. He was not building from emptiness. Normandy mattered. Anjou mattered. His marriage to Eleanor had already transformed his reach. But England gave him something uniquely valuable: a kingdom with administrative depth, wealth, and a desperate need for restored authority. A weaker ruler might have treated that need as ceremony. Henry treated it as opportunity. The broken kingdom gave him his first great political weapon. If men were tired of disorder, he could present himself as order. If barons had grown too independent, he could present control as restoration. If local violence had exhausted the country, he could make royal justice look not like oppression, but relief. That was the beauty of his position. And the danger, because a ruler who restores order after chaos often receives permission to become stronger than anyone intended. The English crown Henry inherited in 1154 was not yet the engine of Angevin dominance. It was bruised, suspicious, and surrounded by men who remembered how much could be taken when kings were weak. But beneath the damage lay resources Henry would soon learn to use: courts, sheriffs, revenue, ports, castles, written commands, and the old prestige of a monarchy that had survived its own near ruin. The young king saw what others had missed. England was not merely a prize. It was a base. From that base, he could discipline the island, finance ambitions across the Channel, confront rival rulers, and bind a scattered inheritance into something that looked, from a distance, like empire. But first, he had to do what Stephen had failed to do. He had to make obedience predictable. And to make obedience predictable, he would need more than soldiers. He would need law. In the next chapter, the story turns from ruined castles and disputed crowns to the marriage that changed Europe. Because while England taught Henry the cost of disorder, Eleanor of Aquitaine gave him the scale of a dream no English king had ever held before. The empire did not begin with a battle. It began with a woman leaving one king and marrying a man who was not yet another. In March 1152, Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Louis VII of France was annulled. The official reasons belonged to church law, blood relationship, and the cold language of canon lawyers, but everyone close to power understood that the consequences would not remain spiritual. Eleanor was not simply a queen losing a husband. She was Duchess of Aquitaine, and Aquitaine was not a jewel to be placed quietly in another man's box. It was a vast, wealthy, difficult, proud territory stretching across southwestern France, with its own customs, courts, noble families, songs, rivalries, ports, vineyards, and old habits of independence. Whoever married Eleanor did not merely gain a wife, he gained a political horizon. 8 weeks after the annulment, she married Henry of Anjou. The shock was immediate. Louis VII had lost the woman. Henry gained the duchy, and the King of France, who had already watched the young Angevin rise through Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, now saw a rival's influence expand deep toward the Pyrenees. No army had marched, no city had burned, yet the balance of Western Europe had changed. That was the quiet violence of dynastic politics. A priest could pronounce a marriage invalid, a noblewoman could remarry, and suddenly castles, roads, river crossings, tolls, markets and lordships had to ask a new question: who now had the right to command? For Eleanor, the marriage was not an act of passive transfer. She was one of the most politically important women of the 12th century. She had been Queen of France. She had seen the machinery of Capetian kingship from the inside. She had participated in the Second Crusade and moved through a world where piety, rumour, diplomacy and ambition often travelled together. She was wealthy, experienced, and dangerous to underestimate. Henry was younger than she was, but he was no minor prince. By 1152, he already carried the weight of Angevin inheritance and Norman expectation. He was restless, sharp, physically energetic, and politically hungry. To marry Eleanor was to transform his future from powerful to alarming. The wedding did what a conquest might have taken decades to achieve. It gave Henry scale. But scale is not the same as control. Aquitaine could be added to Henry's title. It could not be absorbed into his personality. The duchy had old aristocratic networks, fierce local identities, and a political culture that did not behave like England or Normandy. The South was not waiting to become obedient because a marriage document said so. A lord near Poitiers might have received the news without seeing a single soldier. Perhaps the messenger arrived under a hard afternoon sun, with dust on his cloak and the seal of authority still intact. In the hall, men would listen while the words were read aloud. Duchess Eleanor had a new husband. Henry of Anjou now stood inside the political future of Aquitaine. The benches would not move. The wine cups would not tremble, but every man in that room would understand that calculation had changed. Which lord would resist? Which would flatter? Which would wait? Which would write quietly to Paris? Which would send a son to Henry's court and keep another close at home? This is how empires are sometimes born, not with cheers, but with silence, while men measure risk. For Louis VII, the humiliation was enormous. He had lost Eleanor's lands from the immediate orbit of the French crown, and he had watched them pass to a rival whose inheritance already pressed against Capetian weakness. The French king remained Henry's overlord for many continental territories in theory, but in practice, Henry's combined lands were now so extensive that the hierarchy looked almost absurd. The vassal had become more powerful than the lord. That contradiction would define the Angevin world. In England, Henry would soon be king. In Normandy, he was duke. In Anjou, count. In Aquitaine, duke by marriage. In each place, authority had a different shape. A royal command that made sense in England might not carry the same emotional force in Gascony. A Norman baron's obligations were not the same as an Aquitanian noble's pride. The same man could be obeyed in one region as king, in another as duke, in another as husband of the duchess. What kind of state is ruled by one man, but understood in 4 different ways? That was not a philosophical problem, it was administrative danger. Henry and Eleanor's marriage gave the Angevin world its grandeur, but also its instability. Their children would inherit not merely a family name, but a geography of claims. Sons could be assigned regions. A duchy could become a power base, a title could become a grievance, a mother's land could become a son's identity. The more Henry gained, the more dangerous inheritance became. For the moment, though, the future looked magnificent. When Henry became King of England in 1154, the marriage to Eleanor had already made him something more than an English monarch. He was a ruler whose lands formed a giant arc around the western and southern edges of Capetian France. The king in Paris might possess the sacred title of French kingship, but Henry possessed the weight that could make that title feel threatened. The map had become offensive. This did not mean Henry planned a modern empire. Medieval rulers did not think in the clean categories later historians prefer. They thought in rights, inheritances, homage, marriages, oaths, counties, duchies, castles, feudal duties, family claims, and opportunities. Henry's world was not a nation-state waiting to be born. It was a layered possession, alive with contradictions. That was why Eleanor mattered so deeply. She was both bridge and fracture. Through her, Aquitaine entered the Angevin orbit. Through her, Henry's children gained claims that made them more powerful than ordinary princes. Through her, the family acquired a southern identity that Henry could use but never fully own. And later, when conflict inside the family sharpened, Eleanor would not remain a silent symbol of unity. She would become one of the forces through which the empire's internal divisions spoke. The marriage had given Henry reach. It had also given his sons something to fight over. This is one of the crueler truths of dynastic expansion. Every acquisition that strengthens the father can become a temptation to the child. Every new province offers not only revenue and prestige, but a possible answer to a prince's resentment. Why should all this remain under one aging hand? Henry did not yet face that question in its full danger. In the early years, he could look at his position and see victory. England was moving toward him. Normandy and Anjou were his. Aquitaine had come through Eleanor. The Capetian king was contained. The memory of civil war in England made order desirable. The political world seemed ready for a ruler with the energy to dominate it. But beneath the grandeur, the empire already required a form of kingship almost impossible to sustain. Henry had to be present everywhere. If he stayed too long in England, the continent might loosen. If he focused too heavily on Normandy, Aquitaine might resent neglect. If he trusted his sons with too much authority, they might become independent. If he trusted them with too little, they might rebel. If he ignored the French king, legal danger could ripen. If he provoked him too openly, war could come before the system was ready. The wedding of 1152 had created a political giant. It had not given that giant a single spine. And yet, for years, Henry would try to supply that spine himself, through movement, through law, through fear, through relentless attention to detail, through the pressure of a ruler who seemed incapable of remaining still while any part of his world escaped his grip. A weaker man might have lost the Angevin inheritance before it fully formed. Henry would make it work, for a time. But the very effort required to hold it together began shaping his rule into something hard, intrusive, and restless. He had seen what disorder did to England. He had learned that noble independence could devour royal authority. Now he possessed lands so vast that independence was not a local inconvenience. It was an existential threat. So Henry moved to restore fear. Not the wild fear of random violence, the colder fear of courts, sheriffs, summonses, castles, fines, investigations, royal anger, and the sense that the king's hand could reach farther than men wished to believe. The marriage had given him an empire of inheritance. Now he needed an architecture of command, and that meant the story must turn from Eleanor's lands to Henry's system. from the wedding that changed the map to the king who tried to make the map obey. Henry II did not rule like a statue. He ruled like weather. He moved constantly, across England, across the Channel, through Normandy, Anjou, and the restless lands that had come to him through blood and marriage. One month he might be in England, listening to legal disputes. Another, he might be in Normandy, watching the French king's court with suspicion. Then southward again, toward Anjou, Touraine, or the edges of Aquitaine, where obedience could not be assumed simply because a document said it existed. This movement was not restlessness for its own sake. It was government. In the 12th century, power still needed a body. A seal could carry the king's command, but fear travelled best when men believed the king himself might arrive. Henry understood that after the anarchy, England did not need only a crowned ruler, it needed a crown that could be felt. So he made himself felt, not through spectacle alone, not through endless ceremony. Henry's power worked through pressure, legal, financial, military, personal. He pulled authority back toward the centre after years when local lords had grown used to making their own weather. Castles that had multiplied in civil war were brought under control. Sheriffs became instruments of royal reach. Courts became places where the king's justice competed with, and often overpowered, the private justice of local lords. This was not gentle reform. It was recovery with teeth. A baron who had enjoyed the looseness of Stephen's reign could look at Henry's rule and understand the change immediately. The crown was no longer only asking for loyalty. It was measuring, recording, summoning, judging, and taking account. The disorder of the previous generation had taught Henry that a king who waited politely for obedience might wait forever. In England, this lesson became law. Henry's reign saw a major expansion of royal justice. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166 strengthened procedures for identifying criminals through local juries of presentment. The Assize of Northampton in 1176 continued this movement toward a more active royal legal system. These measures were not modern justice in any simple sense, and they were not created from pure moral enlightenment. They were tools of rule. Law made the king present where his body could not be. A royal justice arriving in a county did more than hear cases. He reminded the locality that the king's authority had returned. He carried procedure, parchment, memory, and threat. He transformed private violence into something the crown could notice. In a world where power was often local, this was revolutionary in a quiet and deeply practical way. Imagine a sheriff standing in a timber hall on a cold morning. The floor smells of damp rushes and smoke. Outside, villagers wait under grey light, their cloaks heavy with rain. Inside, a clerk scratches names onto parchment, while men of the 100 are required to speak under oath. Who is accused? Who has fled? Who has stolen? Who has killed? The questions are local, but the authority behind them is not. A generation earlier, such matters might have depended more heavily on the nearest lord. Now the king's shadow entered the room. This is how Henry rebuilt English kingship. Not by making every subject love him, but by making royal order more predictable than aristocratic disorder. A man wronged by a local power might seek the king's justice. A lord who once treated his jurisdiction as private property might find royal officials interfering. A community that remembered civil war could accept intrusion when it arrived dressed as peace. The memory of chaos became Henry's ally. But every strengthening of royal authority created enemies as well as stability. Law could protect, it could also extract. Procedure could discipline violence. It could also expand the number of moments when the crown touched ordinary life. What looked like restoration from the king's point of view might look like encroachment from the view of a noble family that had held its rights for generations. Henry was not unaware of this. He simply believed the risk was necessary. His England had to become the dependable base of a larger Angevin world. The lands across the Channel were too varied, too proud, and too exposed to French pressure for Henry to rely on charisma alone. England's wealth, ports, sheriffs, and increasingly effective administration gave him leverage. If Normandy needed defense, England mattered. If continental politics required money, England mattered. If the king needed a deep reservoir of authority, England mattered. The island was no longer just one part of his inheritance. It was the strong room. And strong rooms must be guarded. Henry's kingship, therefore, developed a hard, practical intelligence. He used law not only to settle disputes, but to draw power inward. He used officials not only to serve justice, but to know the country. He used financial mechanisms not only to fund governance, but to sustain wars, diplomacy, castles, and pressure abroad. The Angevin world could not be held by romance. It needed revenue. It needed documents. It needed men who could ride with orders, collect fines, inspect accounts, and make distant authority feel immediate. Beneath the great names of kings and queens stood lesser figures, clerks with ink-dark fingers, sheriffs with enemies, justices travelling muddy roads, castle constables counting supplies, messengers crossing the Channel with wax-sealed commands. These men rarely dominate the story, but without them, Henry's world dissolves into titles. Still, the system had a problem that no procedure could fully solve. Henry's government could become stronger in England than in many of his continental lands. That imbalance mattered. In England, the crown had a kingdom to command. In Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, Henry ruled through layered lordships, local customs, aristocratic bargains, and feudal obligations. His authority was real, but it did not have the same texture everywhere. The Angevin Empire was therefore strongest where Henry could make institutions serve him. It was weakest where he had to make relationships obey. And relationships are more fragile than records. Aquitaine especially resisted simple control. It was too large, too proud, too attached to Eleanor's identity and to its own noble traditions. A royal order from Henry did not erase generations of local autonomy. Even in Normandy, where ducal authority was stronger and administration more developed, the land remained politically tied to the dangerous fiction of French overlordship. The King of France might be weaker in practical power, but he possessed a legal position that could one day become explosive. Henry's genius was that he could keep all these tensions moving without letting them stop. He managed through speed, through intimidation, through negotiation, through law, through sudden anger and calculated settlement. He appeared where pressure gathered. He forced disputes into channels where he had advantage. He made rebellion costly before it became contagious. But this style of rule came with a hidden cost. The more Henry held together by personal force, the more the system depended on him. His body became the bridge between England and the continent. His will became the hinge between law and inheritance. His attention became the thread connecting Winchester, Rouen, Angers, Poitiers, and the countless lesser places where his authority had to be translated into obedience. What would happen when that attention failed? What would happen when the man who made the system move could no longer move fast enough? This question did not yet dominate the early triumph of his reign. For now, Henry looked like the solution to every disorder that had preceded him. He had ended the uncertainty of Stephen's kingship. He had secured England. He had married into Aquitaine. He had contained barons. He had turned royal justice into a practical weapon. He had made the crown feel heavier in every county it touched. But a ruler who restores fear can begin to believe that every institution must bend. That belief brought him toward the church. The church was not merely a spiritual body in Henry's world. It owned land. It judged clerics. It shaped legitimacy. It spoke in the language of eternity, while kings spoke in the language of command. No medieval ruler could ignore it. No ambitious ruler could resist trying to control it. Henry looked at clerical privilege and saw a gap in royal authority. He looked at church courts and saw men beyond the full reach of royal justice. He looked at the moral independence of bishops and saw potential resistance. So he made a choice that seemed perfectly logical. He placed his trusted friend and chancellor, Thomas Becket, in the most important ecclesiastical office in England, Archbishop of Canterbury. On paper, it was brilliant. If the church could not be easily subdued from outside, perhaps it could be guided from within. Becket had served Henry. He knew the king's mind. He understood court politics, royal needs, and the machinery of government. A loyal archbishop might help turn a dangerous institution into an instrument of order. But Henry had misread the office, or perhaps he had misread the man. Because once Becket wore the vestments of Canterbury, he did not remain merely Henry's servant in sacred clothing. He became the defender of a different authority, one that did not measure itself by royal convenience. The conflict that followed would not be a simple quarrel between two proud men. It would expose the limit of Henry's entire method. He could discipline barons, he could strengthen courts, he could make sheriffs tremble and castles submit. But when royal authority entered the sanctuary, it met a power that claimed to answer to heaven. And in the cold stone of Canterbury Cathedral, Henry's politics would become blood. The sound must have been wrong for a cathedral. Not chanting, not bells, not the soft scrape of sandals over stone or the murmur of monks moving through the winter dark. Steel. On December 29th, 1170, Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, was killed inside Canterbury Cathedral. The place mattered as much as the act itself. A man could be murdered in a road, in a castle yard, in an alley, in a battlefield after the shouting had ended. But to cut down an archbishop inside a sacred church was to drag royal anger into the house of God and leave the blood there for all Christendom to see. Henry II had wanted order. Now order had become scandal. The conflict began with a decision that looked practical, even intelligent. In 1162, Henry placed Thomas Becket in the Archbishopric of Canterbury. Becket was not a stranger pulled suddenly from the cloister. He had been Henry's chancellor, a companion of royal government, a man who understood the court, the king's temperament, the language of administration, the demands of power. To Henry, the appointment must have seemed almost elegant. The church was too important to be left outside royal control. It owned lands, judged clerics, shaped public morality, and stood close to the deepest source of medieval legitimacy. A loyal archbishop could help close the gap between sacred privilege and royal law. Henry thought he was placing a trusted man inside a dangerous institution. But the institution changed the man. Once Becket became archbishop, he did not behave like a royal servant wearing ecclesiastical costume. He became the defender of the church's liberties, or at least of what he believed those liberties required. The transformation shocked Henry because it struck at the heart of his ruling method. Henry expected offices to serve order. Becket began to act as if some offices existed precisely to resist the king. The quarrel was not only personal, it was structural. Henry wanted clerics accused of serious crimes to face the reach of royal justice after church judgment. He wanted the borders between ecclesiastical privilege and royal authority drawn in a way that strengthened the crown. In 1164, the constitutions of Clarendon attempted to define and limit church privilege under royal authority. To Henry, this was not tyranny. It was consistency.
It was government refusing to leave a protected space where law could not fully enter.
To Becket, it looked like invasion. The argument hardened. At court, this may have first appeared as another battle of strong personalities. Henry could be fierce, impatient, volcanic in anger. Becket could be proud, severe, theatrical in resistance. But to reduce the crisis to temperament misses the deeper danger. The Angevin system depended on Henry's ability to make every power inside his world acknowledge his command. The Church was the one institution that could say no in a language older and higher than kingship. A baron could be threatened, a sheriff could be replaced, a castle could be besieged, but an archbishop could turn disobedience into holiness. That was what made Becket dangerous. By the mid-1160s, the conflict had become impossible to contain. Becket was tried at Northampton in 1164 and fled into exile. He spent years outside England, protected in part by the wider world of church politics and continental diplomacy. His absence did not calm the crisis. It internationalized it. A quarrel between king and archbishop became a wound visible to the Pope, the French court, and every political enemy who understood that Henry's power could be embarrassed through conscience. The king, who had rebuilt order after civil war, now faced an opponent who could make order look like sin. Somewhere in Canterbury, during Becket's exile, the routine of the cathedral continued. Monks rose in darkness, candles burned low, ink dried slowly in cold rooms. The psalms were sung, the offices kept, the stone held its winter chill. But even sacred routine would have carried political tension. Every prayer for the archbishop was also a reminder that he was absent because the king's will and the church's claim had collided. This is how large conflicts enter ordinary rooms. Not always as armies, sometimes as a name spoken carefully. When Becket returned to England in 1170, reconciliation had been attempted but not truly achieved. The surface could be patched. The deeper insult remained. Henry's son, Henry the young king, had been crowned by the Archbishop of York and other bishops earlier that year, an act that cut into Canterbury's traditional privileges. Becket responded with ecclesiastical penalties. Once again, authority became a question of who had the right to bless, punish, crown, and condemn. This was not decoration. Coronation was political theology made visible. If a king's power needed sacred confirmation, then control over sacred procedure mattered. Canterbury's claim was not just pride, it was leverage over the meaning of kingship itself. Henry heard of Becket's renewed defiance while he was across the Channel. The exact words Henry spoke in anger remain tangled in later tradition. The famous line often attached to him, asking who would rid him of the troublesome priest, should be treated with caution. Chroniclers shaped memory. Political murder attracts dramatic sentences the way battlefields attract legends, but the result is not uncertain. 4 knights crossed to England. They came to Canterbury, and inside the cathedral, they killed the archbishop. A monk witnessing the scene would not have needed political theory to understand the horror. The cathedral air would have been cold, the stone underfoot unforgiving. Voices would have risen, first in argument, then confusion, then terror. The smell of candle smoke would mix with sweat, wet wool, and the metallic presence of drawn weapons where weapons did not belong. The murder did not make Henry stronger. It exposed him. That was the terrible reversal. Henry had spent his reign trying to pull authority inward, to make law and order answer to the crown. But Becket's death allowed the church to claim the moral high ground with devastating force. The archbishop became a martyr. Canterbury became a place of pilgrimage. Henry, whether or not he had ordered the killing directly, was marked by the blood spilled in the atmosphere of his anger. In 1174, Henry performed public penance at Canterbury. The image is almost too powerful to ignore. The king who had tried to master the church, walking barefoot, humbling himself before the shrine of the man whose death had become a judgment on royal excess. It did not destroy Henry's reign. He survived. He remained formidable. His authority did not collapse overnight. But something had changed. The Becket crisis taught a lesson Henry could not easily absorb. Not every institution could be subdued without consequence. Law could extend royal power, but sacred legitimacy could wound it. A king might command bodies, offices, castles, revenues, and courts. Yet if he appeared to violate the moral order that made kingship acceptable, his victory could become defeat. The Angevin Empire needed the church, not because Henry was weak, because medieval power required more than force. It required the appearance of righteousness, the cooperation of bishops, the blessing of ritual, the language of Christian order, and the belief that obedience to the king did not endanger the soul. Becket's blood turned that relationship into a public problem, and the timing mattered. Henry's power was already vast. His lands stretched across a political world no English king before him had controlled. His government was becoming sharper. His law was reaching deeper. His reputation was immense. But the Becket affair revealed the cost of his temperament and the danger of his method. He could push too hard. He could misjudge the independence of men he thought he had placed. He could convert a dispute of jurisdiction into a crisis of holiness. The empire survived the cathedral, but it did not emerge untouched. The murder at Canterbury became a warning written in stone. Royal authority could expand, but if it crossed the wrong threshold, resistance might become sacred. And sacred resistance was harder to defeat than armed rebellion, because it did not need to win a battle to change the story. Henry had restored fear in England. Now he had learned that fear had limits. Yet the deepest threat to his power was still not the church. The church could shame him, wound him, and force him to kneel, but it could not divide his inheritance from the inside. His sons could, and while pilgrims began to move toward Canterbury, while Becket's shrine gathered meaning, while Henry repaired what could be repaired, another danger waited inside the royal family, quieter than cathedral violence, more intimate than public penance, and far more dangerous to the future of the Angevin world. The next rebellion would not come from an archbishop. It would come from Henry's own blood. The crown on Henry the young king's head was real. That was the insult. In 1170, Henry II had his eldest surviving son crowned king during his own lifetime. The ceremony was meant to secure succession, to show the world that the Angevin future was orderly, planned, undeniable. A crowned son could discourage rivals. A public heir could make the dynasty look stable. After the anarchy, no English king could forget the danger of an uncertain inheritance. But Henry the young king received the symbol without the substance. He was called king, but he did not rule England. He had title, honor, ceremony, and expectation. What he lacked was the thing ambitious men understand immediately when they do not possess it: usable power. No treasury, no independent government, no authority equal to the name placed upon him. For Henry II, this arrangement made sense. The father had seen civil war. He knew what happened when power was divided before the center was secure. He had built too much, fought too hard, and restored too much order to let impatient sons carve pieces out of his living body. The Angevin dominion was not a simple inheritance waiting in a chest. It was a dangerous construction held together by movement, law, fear, negotiation, and the king's own relentless attention. To divide it too early was to invite disaster. To refuse division entirely was to invite rebellion. That was the trap. Henry's sons had grown up inside a world too large for ordinary princely patience. They were not minor heirs waiting for a provincial estate. They saw England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, Brittany, castles, ports, revenues, courts, and armies circling their family name. They had been raised close enough to power to smell it, but not close enough to command it. Henry, the young king, felt this most sharply. His coronation had made him visible. It had also made his dependence humiliating. A king who must ask his father for money is not a king in the eyes of men trained to measure honor by command. Around him gathered flatterers, young knights, dissatisfied nobles, and older political players who understood that a prince's resentment could become a weapon. Richard, meanwhile, had been associated with Aquitaine. Geoffrey was connected to Brittany through marriage. Even John, still the youngest and not yet the central disaster of the story, existed as another piece on Henry's family board. Their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was not a passive figure watching from the edge. Her lands, her sons, and her political dignity were all tied to the future Henry was trying to control. By 1173, the private pressure became public revolt. Henry the young king rebelled against his father. Richard and Geoffrey joined. Eleanor supported the movement and attempted to reach her sons, but she was captured and would spend many years confined under Henry's authority. The rebellion drew in outside powers as well. Louis VII of France, long threatened by Angevin expansion, saw opportunity. William the Lion of Scotland entered the conflict. Discontented barons in England and on the continent tested the strength of the king who had spent his life teaching them obedience. The family quarrel became a European crisis. That is what made it so dangerous. A son's anger alone could be contained. A son's anger supported by rival kings, border lords, restless barons, and regional grievances could begin to loosen the entire structure. The Angevin world was too wide for rebellion in one place to remain purely local. Trouble in Normandy could encourage trouble in England. Anger in Aquitaine could invite Capetian interference. A dispute at the dinner table could become war across a map. Picture a garrison soldier in Normandy hearing the news. He stands on a wall in damp wind, looking out beyond the ditch and road. His cloak smells of wool and smoke. He expects enemies to carry the banners of foreign lords. Instead, rumor tells him that the king's own sons are in arms. Somewhere beyond the frontier, men speak of the young king. Somewhere else, they speak of Richard. The soldier may not understand the legal arguments or family humiliations behind the revolt, but he understands the fear. If the royal family is divided, whose command is safe to obey? This was the question rebellion forced upon the empire. Henry had spent years making obedience predictable. Now his own children made obedience uncertain. Every lord had to calculate not only loyalty, but timing. Would the father win? Would the sons inherit soon? Would supporting the rebellion bring reward later? Would remaining loyal bring punishment from the next generation? Succession turned the future into a battlefield before the old king was dead. Henry responded with the energy that had always made him formidable. He moved, negotiated, struck, and contained the danger before it could fully harden. In 1174, the revolt collapsed. William the Lion was captured at Alnwick, a blow that transformed the northern theatre. Barons who had tested rebellion found the cost rising. The sons were forced back into submission. Eleanor remained under Henry's control. The king had won. But the victory was not clean. A defeated rebellion can still teach the rebels what is possible. Henry had proven that he could beat his sons in war. He had not proven that he could make them trust him. he had not solved the problem of giving real authority without losing control. He had not made the young king feel less decorative, Richard less attached to Aquitaine, Geoffrey less politically ambitious, or Eleanor less central to the emotional geography of the family. The rebellion ended. The grievance survived. This is where Henry's greatest strength became a limitation. His instinct was to hold, manage, delay, supervise. He believed that control prevented chaos because he had seen chaos in England. But his sons did not remember the anarchy as he did. They did not carry Stephen's failure in their bones. They had grown up beneath a father whose success made their own dependence feel intolerable. To Henry, patience was stability. To his sons, patience was erasure. The young king's position remained especially poisonous. He had the public dignity of kingship without its machinery. His household required funds. His companions expected reward. His honor demanded display. But his father kept the real levers in his own hands. Medieval lordship was not abstract. A prince needed lands to grant, revenues to spend, justice to administer, followers to bind. Without these, he became a magnificent ornament, surrounded by men whispering that he deserved more. And whispers matter. In royal families, they can become policy. Henry's sons were not simply spoiled children. That interpretation is too easy and too modern. They were political actors inside a system that had taught them inheritance was destiny. Their father had accumulated lands by blood and marriage. Why should they not expect blood to deliver something to them while they were still young enough to use it? The Angevin Empire was built from claims. The sons learned the lesson too well. For Eleanor, the revolt carried a different meaning. She had brought Aquitaine into Henry's world, but Aquitaine was never merely Henry's possession. Through Richard especially, the duchy became linked to a future that did not depend entirely on the father. Eleanor's support for her sons can be read through many lenses: maternal, political, regional, personal. And the evidence does not allow us to turn her inner life into certainty. But the pattern is clear enough. Henry's family was also a map of competing interests. A wife could be Queen of England and Duchess of Aquitaine. A son could be heir and rival. A father could be ruler and obstacle. No law could make those roles harmless. After the revolt, Henry tried to repair the surface. His sons were reconciled with him in formal terms. Lands and allowances were adjusted. Political arrangements shifted. But reconciliation in medieval monarchy often meant that men kissed in public while continuing to count injuries in private. The cameras of modern history are not there, of course. We cannot enter the chamber and hear the exact breath before apology. We cannot invent the look between father and son. But we can see the structure around them. Henry's dominion required unity. His family produced competition. That contradiction would not go away. The young king would rebel again later and die in 1183 before ever becoming the sole ruler his title promised. Geoffrey would die in 1186, leaving Brittany as another knot in the inheritance. Richard would become the dominant son, warrior, duke, crusader, and eventually king. John, once the youngest figure on the edge of the arrangement, would outlive them all and inherit a world damaged by every unresolved quarrel before him. But in 1173 and 1174, the central truth had already been revealed. The Angevin Empire could survive an archbishop's martyrdom. It could survive baronial unrest. It could survive foreign hostility. It could even survive the first great rebellion of Henry's sons. What it could not survive forever was the need to repeat that survival inside the family itself. Each reconciliation left a bruise. Each settlement postponed a deeper decision. Each son learned that rebellion might fail, but it could still force attention. Each enemy learned that Angevin power was most vulnerable not at its frontiers, but wherever inheritance touched resentment. Henry II had built his world to prevent the return of civil war. Yet inside his own house, the logic of civil war had already returned in miniature. Father against sons, queen against husband, brother measuring brother, and beyond them all, the King of France watching carefully. The revolt of 1173 to 1174 did not destroy Henry. In some ways, it proved his strength. He suppressed a coalition that might have broken a lesser ruler. He reasserted authority. He kept the empire intact. But the cost was trust. And trust, once lost inside a dynasty, is harder to rebuild than a castle wall. The next stage of the story would belong to Richard, the son who turned Angevin ambition into crusading legend, military brilliance, and unbearable expense. Under him, the empire would still look formidable. Its banners would still fly. Its enemies would still fear its armies. But the old problem remained beneath the armor. A dominion held by warriors must keep paying for war. And Richard the Lionheart would make glory expensive. Richard inherited a world that already knew how to bleed. When Henry II died in 1189, the Angevin dominion did not collapse. Not yet. The map still looked vast. England remained under Plantagenet rule. Normandy still guarded the Channel. Anjou and Touraine remained tied to the family's continental identity. Aquitaine, the fierce southern inheritance of Eleanor, still stood inside the Angevin orbit. The structure survived the father, but survival is not the same as healing. Richard I came to power with a reputation that would outlive almost every administrative detail of his reign. Later memory would call him the Lionheart, and the name still carries the sound of steel, crusading banners, desert heat, and battlefield courage. He was a king made for legend. That was part of the problem. Richard understood war, honor, speed, and pressure. He knew how to command men in violent situations. He knew how to project royal charisma across distance. He could frighten enemies and inspire followers. In a political world where reputation was not decoration but currency, Richard's fame mattered. Yet the Angevin system did not need only a warrior. It needed a ruler who could make England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and restless vassals endure the cost of being connected. It needed money. It needed administration. It needed castles repaired, ships supplied, officials trusted, nobles managed, and rivals watched. Glory could defend a frontier for a season. It could not replace government. Richard became king in 1189 and almost immediately turned toward crusade. The Third Crusade was not an eccentric adventure outside politics. For a 12th century ruler, crusading could be an act of faith, honor, reputation, and international kingship. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in 1187. Across Latin Christendom, the loss carried enormous spiritual and political weight. A king who took the cross stepped into a drama larger than his own kingdom. But even holy war needed coin. England became a reservoir for Richard's ambition. Offices were sold, revenues were gathered, arrangements were made to fund departure, ships, soldiers, equipment, and the vast logistical burden of moving royal war across seas. A king who would spend much of his reign outside England still required England to pay for the meaning of his kingship. A sheriff in an English shire may never have seen Acre, Cyprus, or the walls of the Holy Land, but he could feel the crusade in demands, accounts, and pressure. Picture him in a cold chamber, examining payments by candlelight. Parchment curls at the edge of the table. A clerk waits with a sharpened quill.
Outside, men complain that the king's glory is being purchased with money pulled from estates, towns, and local obligations. The battlefield was far away. The bill was local. This was one of Richard's deepest political contradictions. His fame strengthened the dynasty's aura, but the machinery of that fame made kingship expensive. He could become a hero to chroniclers while still tightening the fiscal grip on those who funded his absence. He could make the Angevin name thunder across Christendom while leaving the day-to-day strain to officials, ministers, and family members. And absence created opportunity. While Richard was on crusade, the Angevin world did not freeze obediently in place. His brother John maneuvered. Philip II of France, who had gone on crusade as well, returned earlier and began to test the edges of Richard's position. The French king was not a man of Richard's theatrical brilliance, but he possessed something equally dangerous: patience, sharpened by institutional purpose. Philip understood the old contradiction. Richard was king in England, but on the continent he held lands that stood inside the feudal framework of the French crown. The Plantagenet dominion looked overwhelming on a map, but its legal foundations could be attacked one obligation at a time. Philip did not need to match Richard's legend. He needed to find where the legend had to obey law, money, and geography. Richard's capture on his return from crusade turned glory into financial emergency. In 1192, he was seized near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria and eventually handed over to Emperor Henry VI. The ransom demanded for his release was enormous. To free the heroic king, his subjects had to produce a staggering sum. Churches, nobles, officials, and communities all felt the extraction. This was not just an episode of adventure, it was a demonstration of how fragile a heroic monarchy could be when the hero became a captive asset. Imagine a church treasury opened under pressure. Candlesticks, silver vessels, coins gathered from devotion and obligation, all counted not for local need, but for the release of a king whose body had become a financial problem. The sacred metal leaves the familiar dark of the church and enters the arithmetic of ransom. A king's fame had created loyalty. His captivity demanded liquidation. When Richard finally returned, he did not return to peace. He returned to a political world in which Philip had taken advantage of his absence and John's disloyalty had exposed the danger inside the family again. The old Angevin illness had not disappeared with Henry II. It had merely taken a new form. Brother against brother was no longer the central structure of rebellion, but the possibility remained alive. Richard forgave John more than John deserved, at least in practical terms, because dynastic politics often forced rulers to use men they could not fully trust. The Angevin family had too few safe pieces on the board. Blood was dangerous, but it was also necessary. A brother could betray. A brother could also be the only available heir. Against Philip, Richard threw himself into war with characteristic intensity. The conflict in Normandy became the great test of his continental kingship. Here, Richard was in his element. Fortresses, campaigns, rapid movement, military pressure, personal command. He understood that Normandy was not just another possession. It was the hinge between England and the Angevin lands in France. If Normandy fell, the Channel would become less a bridge than a dividing wound. To defend it, Richard built Château Gaillard. The fortress rose above the Seine near Les Andelys, a statement in stone aimed directly at French ambition. It was not simply a castle. It was strategy made visible. From its height, it guarded the approach toward Rouen and declared that Richard understood how geography could be forced into obedience. Stone, lime, timber, iron, sweat. Men hauled materials, masons worked the walls, labourers shaped a royal answer to Philip's pressure. The castle was expensive, provocative, and brilliant in conception. It showed Richard at his most formidable, seeing the military problem clearly and answering it with speed. But castles also reveal fear. No ruler builds such a fortress unless he knows the frontier is in danger. Château Gaillard protected Normandy, but it also exposed the cost of keeping the Angevin world intact. The empire needed more than inherited titles. It needed permanent militarization along vulnerable lines. It needed garrisons. It needed repairs. It needed trained men who could hold walls when the king was absent. It needed money again and again. Richard could win battles of pressure. The question was whether his system could outlast him. For a while, his energy held Philip back. The French king advanced, withdrew, calculated, returned. Richard's presence mattered. Like Henry before him, he supplied personal force to a structure that needed more than institutions could provide. But Richard's force was different from Henry's. Henry had been a builder of law and control. Richard was a commander of war. He kept the empire dangerous. He did not make it safer. In 1199, the end came not in a grand battle against Philip, not beneath the walls of Paris, not in some final act worthy of his legend. Richard was wounded during the siege of Chaillot-Chabrol in Limousin, a relatively minor conflict in the hard local world of lordship and resistance. The wound turned fatal. The Lionheart died from a small war. The irony is almost unbearable. A king who had crossed seas, faced Saladin, endured captivity, and fought the King of France, was brought down at the edge of a local dispute, in the kind of regional violence that made the Angevin world so difficult to govern. It was not the scale of the event that mattered, it was the consequence. Richard left no legitimate son, and suddenly the Angevin inheritance faced the question Henry II had never solved. Who had the better right to rule a dominion built from overlapping claims? John, Richard's brother, moved toward the crown. Arthur of Brittany, son of Geoffrey, carried another claim through a different line of inheritance. In some regions, John looked like the practical successor. In others, Arthur's claim had force. For Philip II of France, the dispute was a gift wrapped in law. The warrior king was dead. The legal battlefield opened. Richard had defended the Angevin world with courage, speed, and violence. His reign had preserved the image of strength, but beneath that image, the same old weaknesses remained. Expensive war, contested succession, continental vulnerability, dependence on personal command, and a French king waiting for the family to divide itself again. When Richard died, the empire did not immediately fall, but it lost the man who could make enemies hesitate. What came next was not merely the reign of John, it was the inheritance of every unpaid bill, every unresolved claim, every insult between brothers, every legal contradiction between king and vassal, and every castle that still needed a ruler strong enough to make its walls mean something. John did not receive a throne. He received a trap. The crown did not pass cleanly. That was the danger. When Richard I died in 1199 from the wound he received at Chaillot, the Angevin world did not simply lower one king into the grave and raise another without question. The old king was dead. The warrior was gone. The man whose reputation had made enemies hesitate could no longer stand between the empire and its contradictions. And in the silence after him, inheritance began to speak in more than one voice. John, Richard's youngest brother, moved quickly. He was an adult, a son of Henry II, a man already known to the political world, and the practical candidate for those who wanted continuity without delay. In England and Normandy, many could accept him. He was not loved, but medieval succession did not require affection. It required recognition, force, and enough important men willing to treat the claim as real. But John was not the only possibility. Arthur of Brittany, the young son of John's dead brother Geoffrey, also had a claim. By the logic of representation, Arthur could be seen as standing in the place of his father Geoffrey, who had been older than John. In some territories, especially where the rules of inheritance and political interests pointed differently, Arthur was more than a child with a name. He was an alternative future. This was the trap Richard left behind. Not because Richard had planned it, because the Angevin Empire had always been vulnerable to succession becoming geography. John's claim was stronger in some places, Arthur's claim had weight in others. The family inheritance was not a single object that could be handed from one pair of hands to another. It was a cluster of lands, customs, loyalties, and legal expectations. England might answer one way. Anjou might hesitate. Brittany might see opportunity. Aquitaine might calculate through Eleanor. Normandy might ask who could actually defend it. A crown passed sideways is never only a ceremony. It is an invitation to measure. Somewhere in Normandy, a lord would have understood the problem before any chronicler explained it. Imagine him in a stone chamber, listening to messengers arrive from different directions. One brings news that John has been recognized. Another speaks of Arthur. A third carries rumors from Philip II's court. Outside, rain gathers in the courtyard. Horses stamp in the mud. A household clerk waits beside a wax tablet, because loyalty must eventually become a written answer. The Lord's question is not moral, it is practical. Who will win? That calculation is the sound of an empire beginning to loosen. John's position depended on speed. He needed recognition before uncertainty became organized. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now elderly but still politically significant, supported him. Her role mattered. She was not simply a mother offering family preference. She remained the living connection to Aquitaine, the woman whose marriage had helped create the Angevin world. Her support gave John weight in regions where blood, memory, and ducal legitimacy could not be separated. But support could not erase the problem. Arthur's claim gave Philip II of France exactly what he needed, a way to turn a family dispute into a political weapon. Philip did not have to invent Angevin weakness. He only had to name it, organize it, and wait for John to make it worse. The French king had learned through decades of rivalry that the Plantagenet dominion was too large to defeat easily when united, but dangerously exposed when divided. Henry II had survived rebellion because he was fast, feared, and personally commanding. Richard had survived because he was militarily terrifying. John inherited neither Henry's authority nor Richard's legend. What he did inherit was the legal contradiction at the heart of Angevin power. In England, John was king. In France, for lands such as Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, he was a great lord inside the feudal world of the French crown. That meant Philip could present pressure not simply as conquest, but as judgment. If John failed in his obligations as a vassal, if he mishandled disputes, if his legitimacy became vulnerable, Philip could cloak aggression in law. This was the brilliance of Capetian patience. War would come wearing legal clothes. In 1200, John and Philip made the Treaty of Le Goulet. On the surface, it offered recognition and settlement. Philip recognized John's possession of key continental lands. John, in turn, accepted terms that included concessions and acknowledged the feudal relationship that bound his French territories to the French crown. To a ruler under pressure, recognition is tempting. John needed breathing space. He needed enemies to pause. He needed the world to accept that he, not Arthur, stood at the head of the Angevin inheritance. A treaty could make uncertainty look resolved. It could tell wavering lords that the matter had been settled by the great men of Christendom. But treaties do not remove weakness when the weakness sits inside the terms. The Goulet gave John recognition, but it also confirmed the framework through which Philip could later attack him. The French king did not need to deny John everything immediately. It was enough to make John's position depend on obligations that could be interpreted, challenged, and punished. John had bought time with vulnerability. This is where his tragedy begins to take shape. Not because he was doomed from birth, not because every story about him must move toward villainy. John was intelligent, active, administratively capable, and often more energetic than his reputation allows. He understood money. He understood documents. He understood the usefulness of royal pressure, but he had a gift for making necessary pressure feel like personal insult. A ruler in John's position needed trust more than brilliance. He needed magnates to believe that loyalty would be rewarded, that risk would be shared, that defeat would not be blamed downward, that the king's judgment could be endured even when disliked. John often produced the opposite feeling. Men might obey him, fewer trusted him. That distinction mattered, because the Angevin Empire had always required cooperation from men who had options. In Normandy, a noble family might hold land, memory, and connections that reached both sides of the frontier. In Anjou, local loyalties did not dissolve because John wore a crown in Westminster. In Poitou and Aquitaine, aristocrats could be stubborn, opportunistic, and deeply aware that distance gave them room to maneuver. If they doubted John's ability to defend them, they would not necessarily rebel at once. They would wait. Waiting is a political act, and Philip knew how to encourage it. The Arthur question continued to poison John's reign. The young claimant became a focus for opposition, a figure around whom dissatisfied forces could gather. His youth made him vulnerable, but it also made him useful. Men could project hopes onto him. Philip could support him when convenient. Regional powers could treat him as leverage against John. The story of Arthur's final fate must be handled carefully. Later accounts would darken John's name further, and historians have long treated the evidence with caution. What is clear is that Arthur was captured by John in 1202 and later disappeared from the historical record. Suspicion fell heavily on John, and whether every detail told by later writers is reliable or not, the political consequence was unmistakable. A rival claimant vanished. Trust vanished with him. For many continental lords, the disappearance of Arthur did not need a courtroom-level certainty to have political effect. In aristocratic politics, reputation could harden faster than proof. If men believed John capable of destroying a nephew, they also had to ask what loyalty to him might eventually cost them. Fear can hold a kingdom. Distrust can empty it. John's handling of Arthur did not merely remove a rival. It helped Philip present the Angevin king as a lord unworthy of confidence, a man whose rule could be opposed not only for advantage, but under the language of justice and feudal discipline. The family dispute became something larger, a case against John's legitimacy as a continental ruler. The trap was closing, and notice how little of it depended on a single battlefield. The collapse of Angevin power under John began as law, succession, reputation, and loyalty. It began in who had the right to inherit, who had the authority to judge, who trusted whom, and which lord believed his future was safer under John than under Philip. Only later would the castles fall. Only later would the walls of Normandy become the image of disaster. Before stone breaks, confidence breaks. John still had resources. England remained wealthy. Royal administration could raise money. Eleanor's support still mattered in the early years. Some nobles stayed loyal. The Angevin name had not yet lost all force. To imagine the outcome as inevitable would be too simple. Many crises become fatal only because rulers answer them badly. John's problem was that each answer created a new question. Recognition from Philip brought dependence on French legal structures. Pressure on rivals brought suspicion. Assertion of authority brought resistance. The need to fund defense would later alienate English barons. The need to appear strong made compromise look dangerous. The need to control the inheritance made the inheritance harder to hold. This was not incompetence alone. It was a system under stress. Henry II had held the Angevin world through extraordinary personal command. Richard had defended it through warlike charisma. John needed to hold it through legitimacy, trust, law, and coalition building at the very moment when all four were failing. Across the Channel, Philip II watched the pattern with cold attention. He did not need to be more glamorous than John. He did not need the songs that followed Richard. He did not need to rule more land at the beginning of the contest. He needed only to understand that the Angevin Empire was most vulnerable when its ruler could be isolated from his own vassals. And John, step by step, made isolation easier. By 1202, the conflict had sharpened. Philip moved against John's continental possessions under the logic of feudal judgment. Arthur's claim had become part of the pressure. Norman loyalty began to look less certain. The great fortress system Richard had built would soon be tested without Richard alive to command it. The Angevin world had survived the anarchy, the Becket scandal, the rebellion of Henry's sons, the crusade, ransom, and Richard's death. But now the danger was different. It was no longer only family against family. It was law against inheritance, trust against fear. A patient king against a mistrusted one. John had inherited the largest political structure in Western Europe. But inside that inheritance lay a trap set by blood, sealed by treaty, sharpened by reputation, and watched by a French king who understood that an empire does not need to be conquered all at once. Sometimes it only needs to be summoned to court. And when it fails to answer, the walls begin to fall. Chateau Gaillard was built to make fear look permanent. It rose above the Seine like a threat carved into stone, sharp, exposed, defiant. Richard the Lionheart had ordered it built to guard the road to Rouen, to block Philip II of France, to turn geography itself into a weapon. From its walls, a soldier could look down on the river and understand the message without hearing a single royal speech. Normandy would not be taken easily. That was what the fortress said. But stone can only defend what men still believe is worth defending. By 1202, the Angevin world had entered a new kind of danger. Philip II was no longer merely testing the edges of John's inheritance. He was moving with the confidence of a king who understood that law could prepare the road for conquest. John's position as lord of his French territories made him vulnerable to feudal judgment, and Philip used that vulnerability with patience. The language was legal. The consequence was military. John was not attacked only as a foreign enemy. He was treated as a vassal who had failed in obligation, a lord whose lands could be declared forfeit. This mattered because it gave Philip's aggression the appearance of order. He was not simply grabbing territory. He was presenting himself as the king enforcing rights. That distinction was deadly. The Angevin Empire had always depended on layered identities. John could be sovereign in England and subordinate in France. He could command sheriffs across the Channel while still being summoned, judged, and challenged under the feudal authority of the French crown. Under Henry II, this contradiction had been managed by personal power. Under Richard, it had been held back by military pressure. Under John, it became a trapdoor. Philip did not need every Norman lord to love him. He needed them to doubt John. and doubt had already begun to spread.
Arthur of Brittany's claim had poisoned the early years of John's reign. John's capture of Arthur at Mirabeau in 1202 might have looked at first glance like a victory. A dangerous rival had been seized. A rebellious coalition had been checked. The king had acted with speed and force. But victory became shadow. Arthur later disappeared from the record, and suspicion gathered around John. The exact details remain debated, and later chroniclers sharpened the story in ways that must be handled cautiously. Yet politically, certainty was not required. Aristocratic society often acts on belief before proof. If continental lords believed John capable of destroying his young nephew, they had to ask what kind of loyalty such a ruler deserved, and what kind of risk loyalty to him might bring. A captured rival can remove one problem. A vanished rival can create a legend of mistrust. In Normandy, trust mattered as much as walls. The duchy was not simply a line on the map. It was a network of noble families, castles, towns, roads, ports, obligations, and memories. John needed Norman lords to believe he would defend them, reward them, and remain present enough to make loyalty rational. If they suspected he could not protect them, they would begin to calculate alternatives. This is how a province begins to fall before the siege is finished. Not in flames, in private arithmetic. A Norman noble might stand in a chamber with two futures before him. On one side, John, King of England, heir of Henry II, still wealthy, still dangerous, but increasingly mistrusted and often absent. On the other, Philip, King of France, patient, advancing, legally armed, and close enough to punish hesitation. The noble does not need to be a traitor in his own mind. He only needs to decide which lord can still make promises real. Loyalty becomes a question of distance, and John was often too far away. The military pressure tightened around Château Gaillard in 1203. The fortress was formidable, but no castle exists outside politics. It needs supplies, relief, surrounding loyalty, a functioning field army, and confidence that someone beyond the walls has a plan. Richard had built Château Gaillard as an answer to Philip, but Richard was dead, and the fortress now stood as a monument to a strategy that required a king like Richard to complete it. Philip came methodically. He did not need to break the Angevin world in one blow. He could isolate, besiege, pressure, and wait. Siege warfare was not only violence, it was patience organized against hunger. It turned time into a weapon. Every day inside the walls, food mattered more than honor. Every week without relief made the defending king look smaller. Picture the garrison during the long siege. Rain darkens the outer stone. Smoke clings low in cramped rooms. Men count grain by touch and candlelight. Leather stiffens in the cold. Somewhere below, the Seine moves as if politics has nothing to do with water. The soldiers can see the strength of the walls around them, but walls do not answer the question whispered in every siege. Is help coming? That question destroys men quietly. Outside the fortress, Philip's forces tightened control. Inside, the defenders endured. The siege of Château Gaillard stretched from 1203 into 1204. It became more than a military operation. It became a test of John's ability to make his kingship credible on Norman soil. And John failed that test.
He had attempted campaigns and maneuvers. He had not simply slept through disaster.
But by late 1203, his position in Normandy had become increasingly untenable. He crossed back to England, leaving the defense of the duchy to others. There may have been practical reasons: money, planning, political calculation, the need to gather resources. But in the eyes of men watching Normandy's walls, absence could look like abandonment. A ruler can have explanations. His vassals remember the image. The image was this: Philip pressing forward, John gone, Chateau Gaillard isolated. When the fortress fell in March 1204, the psychological effect was enormous. This was not just the loss of stone, it was the collapse of Richard's warning to Philip. The castle that had declared Normandy defensible now became proof that Angevin defense could be broken. After Chateau Gaillard, the road to Rouen lay exposed. Normandy's fall accelerated. Towns and castles that might have resisted longer under a more trusted and present king began to reconsider their position. Rouen, the great Norman capital, could not hold out forever without a realistic hope of relief. In June 1204, it surrendered to Philip. The loss was devastating. Normandy had been more than territory. It was the ancestral heart of the Norman kings of England, the bridge between island and continent, the old source of aristocratic identity, binding English monarchy to French lordship. Since 1066, the relationship between England and Normandy had shaped the politics of both sides of the Channel. To lose Normandy was to cut through the memory of conquest itself. John had not merely lost land, he had lost the hinge. The Angevin world had depended on the Channel as a connection. Ships could cross it with money, men, orders, and royal presence. England and Normandy had formed a political pair. But after 1204, the Channel increasingly became a line of separation. What had once joined the Plantagenet world now reminded everyone of what had been severed. The material consequences were immediate and deep. Revenue was lost, castles were lost, Norman aristocratic networks were disrupted. Cross-channel families were forced into painful choices between lands held in England and lands now under Capetian authority. The Plantagenet king's prestige suffered. Philip's monarchy gained strength, territory, and momentum. The French crown, once overshadowed by the vast Angevin arc, now stood taller in the very regions that had made Henry II so threatening. The balance of Western Europe changed again. This time not through marriage, through forfeiture, siege, mistrust, and surrender. John's reputation never recovered. Later memory would make him almost the perfect failed king. Treacherous, petty, cruel, unlucky, incompetent. That image is too simple, but it grew from real political wounds. His contemporaries had watched him lose the lands his father had dominated and his brother had defended. They had watched Philip advance under the cover of law and force. They had watched fortresses fall while money continued to be demanded. The barons of England would not forget. Why should they pay for a king who had lost Normandy? Why should they fund campaigns to recover lands that seemed to vanish into failure? Why should they trust a ruler whose continental vassals had drifted, whose nephew had disappeared, whose enemies had grown stronger, and whose demands only increased as his prestige shrank? These questions did not yet produce Magna Carta, but they began preparing the road
to Runnymede.
The fall of Normandy transformed John's reign from a difficult inheritance into a crisis of legitimacy.
Before 1204, he could still appear as the contested but plausible successor of the Angevin achievement. After 1204, he became the king who had lost the duchy.
The accusation was simple enough for every enemy to understand, and heavy enough for every future demand to carry.
Loss changes the sound of taxation. A demand for money before disaster may be presented as defense. A demand after disaster sounds like punishment. That was the problem John now faced. To recover what he had lost, he needed resources.
To gather resources, he had to pressure England. But the more he pressured England, the more the English political class resented paying for continental failure. Every financial measure became tied to humiliation across the Channel. Every royal demand carried the ghost of Chateau Gaillard. In that sense, Normandy did not fall only in 1204. It kept falling inside English politics for the next decade. Philip had achieved more than conquest. He had forced John into a new relationship with his own kingdom. England, once the strong room of Angevin power, would now be squeezed harder to fund restoration. The island that had helped Henry II dominate a continental world would become the place where John's failed continental ambitions turned inward against him. The fortress above the Seine had been built to stop a French king. Its fall helped create an English rebellion. That was the long consequence of Normandy's collapse. A military defeat became a financial crisis. A financial crisis became a political crisis. A political crisis became a challenge to kingship itself. John still had a crown. He still had England. He still had officials, castles, ships, coin, and legal authority. But after Normandy, every instrument of royal power had to work harder because belief had grown weaker. The Angevin Empire had not completely vanished. Lands in the south remained contested. Plantagenet ambitions in France did not die overnight. But the great structure of Henry II, the wide northern bridge between England and Normandy, between island revenue and continental lordship, had been broken. And once that bridge was broken, the cost of pretending otherwise became unbearable. The next chapter begins in England, not France. Because after Normandy fell, John turned to the one place that could still pay for his dream of recovery: his own kingdom. And England would pay. Until it refused. After Normandy fell, the war did not end. It changed address. The walls had collapsed across the Channel, but the pressure moved into England, into sheriff's accounts, baronial halls, church treasuries, town purses, royal writs, and the private resentment of men who were being asked to fund a dream already stained by failure. John had lost Normandy in 1204, but he still had to pay for it. That was the cruelty of defeat. Losing territory did not make kingship cheaper. It made kingship more desperate. The lost duchy became a ghost expense, a vanished possession that demanded more money precisely because it was gone. John could not accept the loss as final, without admitting that the Angevin world of Henry II and Richard had broken under his hand. So he pursued recovery, and recovery required coin. England became the reservoir.
It had always been important to Angevin power.
Henry II had used its administrative strength as the firm base beneath his wider dominion. Richard had drawn on it for crusade, ransom, and war. But after 1204, England was no longer funding the defense of a living continental system. It was funding the attempt to resurrect one. That distinction mattered. A baron might endure taxation to defend lands that still seemed secure. He might accept pressure from a king who brought victory, honor, and protection. He might even resent the cost, but obey because the bargain still made sense. John offered a different bargain. Pay more for what has already been lost. The machinery of royal finance grew sharper. Scutage, money paid in place of military service, became one of the most resented instruments of John's reign. Reliefs, fines, feudal incidents, debts to the crown, forest penalties, and the aggressive use of royal rights all helped feed the king's need for revenue. None of these tools were invented by John. Medieval kings had long used lordship to extract money. Henry II and Richard had not been gentlemen with empty hands. But John used the instruments with a frequency and harshness that made them feel predatory. The issue was not only money, it was confidence. When a ruler is trusted, extraction can be presented as necessity. When he is mistrusted, every demand looks like insult. John's problem after Normandy was that his political credit had collapsed faster than his administrative capacity. He could still command officials. He could still send writs. He could still summon payments. But each success in collection deepened the anger that would later make obedience fragile. Imagine a baron's steward in an English manor after another royal demand arrives. The hall is cold. Smoke hangs beneath the beams. On the table lie wax tablets, tally sticks, and a rough account of rents owed by tenants who have already paid more than they expected. Outside, the winter yard is thick with mud. A messenger waits near the door, wrapped in wet wool, carrying the king's authority in sealed form. The steward does not need to understand all of John's continental strategy. He understands the arithmetic. More money must be found. The lord will blame the king. The tenants will blame the lord. The steward will turn numbers into pressure, pressure into collection, collection into resentment. Somewhere far away, John dreams of Poitou, Normandy, lost rights and revenge against Philip. Here in the manor hall, the dream becomes a list of men who must pay. That was how continental failure entered English life, not as a map, as demand. John's government was not incompetent. In some ways, that made the situation worse. A weak administration might have failed to extract enough money and collapsed quickly. John's administration could extract. It could record, pursue, punish, and squeeze. The English royal system that Henry II had strengthened now became the instrument through which John tried to finance restoration abroad. The father's achievement became the son's weapon. And the barons felt it. They did not oppose royal authority because they were innocent lovers of liberty in a modern sense. Many were powerful men defending their own privileges, estates, and political bargaining position. They had no intention of creating democracy. Their anger came from the world they knew: feudal obligation, honor, property, custom, service, reward, and restraint. A king could demand, but demands had to feel bounded by expectation. John repeatedly made them feel boundless. By 1207, extraordinary taxation added to the pressure.
John's government imposed a heavy levy on movable goods and revenues, part of the wider pattern of raising funds for royal purposes.
Towns, churches, and lay society all felt the reach of the crown. The king's officials were not merely collecting routine dues. They were making the realm feel assessed, measured, and converted into future war.
And then came the church conflict. In 1205, after the death of Hubert Walter, the question of who would become Archbishop of Canterbury opened a new confrontation. Pope Innocent III supported Stephen Langton. John resisted. The conflict escalated until England was placed under interdict in 1208, and John himself was excommunicated in 1209.
This might seem like a separate drama. It was not. For John, the dispute with the papacy became another way to control resources. During the conflict, he seized revenues from church lands, turning spiritual crisis into financial opportunity. In the short term, this strengthened his treasury.
In the longer term, it deepened the sense that John's kingship was willing to violate every boundary when money or authority required it. Henry II had been wounded by Becket's martyrdom. John did not produce a Becket. He produced exhaustion. The churches under interdict changed the texture of everyday religious life. Services were restricted.
Bells fell silent in ways ordinary people could feel. Sacred rhythm, which structured time for communities, became part of a royal papal struggle far above them. A village might not grasp every detail of Innocent III's policy or John's resistance, but it could hear the absence of sound. No bell for the familiar hour, no normal burial rite in the expected form, no easy separation between the king's quarrel and the soul's anxiety. John gained money from the church conflict, but the cost was legitimacy. Medieval kingship did not stand outside religion. It needed sacred atmosphere, episcopal cooperation, ritual blessing, and the idea that royal power belonged within Christian order. A king under excommunication did not merely have a political problem. He had become spiritually dangerous to obey too closely, at least in the imagination of a deeply Christian society. Still, John pressed on. He needed a continental campaign. He needed allies. He needed ships, soldiers, mercenaries, and noble cooperation. He needed to undo the shame of 1204. But the more he prepared, the more England felt like a kingdom being drained for a lost inheritance. The Angevin dream had become expensive memory. This is where John's reign reveals one of the hardest truths about political failure. Sometimes the attempt to reverse humiliation creates the conditions for a greater humiliation. John could not simply abandon his French lands without losing face. Yet every effort to recover them forced him to lean harder on the very men whose support he needed.
The money required for restoration damaged the trust required to make restoration possible. A cleaner ruler might have managed this better. A more beloved ruler might have survived it longer. But John had spent years gathering suspicion. Arthur's disappearance, Normandy's fall, quarrels with nobles, harsh financial exactions, and conflict with the church formed a pattern. Each individual act could be defended in practical terms. Together, they told a darker story. This was a king who could demand much, lose much, and blame others for the cost. Baronial anger did not become rebellion immediately, Because rebellion is dangerous. Great lords do not move lightly against a crowned king. They calculate risk, alliances, precedent, and timing. They remember that failure can mean confiscation, ruin, imprisonment, or death. For years, many endured John because endurance still seems safer than open resistance. But endurance has a limit, and John kept testing it. By 1213, his dispute with the papacy forced a dramatic reversal. He submitted to Pope Innocent III and accepted England and Ireland as papal fiefs, receiving them back as vassals. In the short term, this was politically useful. It brought papal support and helped protect him from certain threats. In the eyes of many barons, however, it could look like another humiliation layered upon the loss of Normandy. The king had lost land to Philip. He had quarreled with the church. Then he had submitted to Rome. And still he demanded money for war. This did not make John powerless. It made him dangerous in a different way. A desperate king with administrative tools can hurt the men closest to him. He can collect debts. He can demand hostages. He can manipulate inheritances. He can punish disobedience through legal pressure. John's barons did not face a weak king they could ignore. They faced a mistrusted king strong enough to make their lives difficult and damaged enough to make his demands feel intolerable. That combination is explosive. The campaign John prepared against Philip was meant to restore more than territory. It was meant to restore the meaning of his kingship. If he could defeat the French king, recover lost lands, and prove that Normandy had not been the final verdict, then the resentment in England might become manageable. Victory has a way of laundering harsh policy. Men forgive costs when triumph arrives. But the reverse is also true. Failure turns every past demand into evidence. That was the risk John carried into the next phase. The money had been raised, the pressure had been applied. The barons had been made to feel the weight of continental ambition. The church had been squeezed, then reconciled. England had paid in coin, anxiety, silence, and resentment. Now the king needed success. Not partial movement, not excuses, not another campaign that ended in disappointment. He needed a victory large enough to make the last decade look necessary. Across the Channel, Philip II waited with the patience of a man who had already broken Normandy and understood that John's greatest weakness might not be on the battlefield. It might be behind him, in the kingdom that had paid for the battle before it was fought. John could still raise money. He could still assemble plans. He could still dream of reversing history. But by the time his coalition moved toward the great test of 1214, England had begun to ask a question more dangerous than any French army. What if the King's War was no longer worth the price? The answer would come at Bouvines, and when it came, it would not remain in France. The battle that broke John's kingship was not fought by John. That was the humiliation. In July 1214, on a field near Bouvines in Flanders, the future of the Angevin dream was decided beneath banners John could not personally command. The King of England had spent years gathering money, pressure, resentment, and hope for one great reversal. Normandy had been lost. English barons had been squeezed. The church had been fought, exploited, and reconciled. Alliances had been built with the promise that Philip II of France could finally be forced backward. Now the bill came due. But John was not standing at the center of the decisive field. His plan depended on coalition warfare.
John would attack from the south, operating in Poitou, while his allies struck Philip from the north and east. It was a dangerous but understandable strategy. Philip's power had grown too large to challenge casually. If John could stretch him, surround him, force him to divide his attention, perhaps the losses of 1,204 could be reversed.
The idea was not foolish. It was fragile. Coalitions are made of shared enemies, not shared souls. Each ally enters with his own grievances, ambitions, fears, and limits. Emperor Otto IV needed prestige. The Counts of Flanders and Boulogne had their own reasons to resist Philip. John needed restoration.
They could all stand against the same French king, but that did not mean they were fighting for the same future.
Philip understood this. He had spent years doing what John could not, turning patience into structure.
The Capetian monarchy was still not a modern state, but under Philip it had become more deliberate, more territorially hungry, more capable of using law, finance, and loyalty in combination.
He was not Richard the Lionheart. He did not need to be. He was something more dangerous to John, a king whose victories accumulated.
John's southern campaign faltered before Bouvines even happened. At La Roche-aux-Moines in July 1214, he faced resistance from Prince Louis, Philip's son. John's Poitevin allies proved unreliable. Some refused to fight or melted away when the risk became too high.
The old problem returned in a new form. Men who did not trust John would not always stand firm when his fortunes required it. A campaign can fail before swords fully meet. It fails when confidence drains from the men expected to bleed for it. Imagine a mounted retainer in Poitou watching the mood shift before battle. The horses are restless. Dust sticks to sweat. Men glance toward their lords before looking toward the enemy. Orders pass, but not with conviction. Somewhere in the lines, a calculation moves faster than courage. If John loses, what happens to those who stayed too close? The king's authority is present. Belief is not. John withdrew.
That withdrawal mattered because it left the northern coalition to face Philip without the full pressure John had hoped to create. Then, on July 27th, 1214, near Bouvines, Philip met the Allied army. The battle was fierce, confused, and dangerous enough that Philip himself was reportedly unhorsed during the fighting. But the French royal army held.
The coalition broke. Otto IV's prestige collapsed. The Counts of Flanders and Boulogne were captured. Philip emerged not merely as a victor, but as the king who had defeated a great coalition of enemies and confirmed the rise of Capetian power. For John, the result was catastrophic. Not because he lost a single battlefield under his own eyes, because Bouvines judged the entire policy that had brought him there. Every tax, every scutage, every fine, every harsh demand, every argument that England had to pay because continental recovery was still possible. All of it now returned as accusation. John had asked his realm to fund restoration. The restoration had failed.
He had asked barons to endure pressure for the sake of lost lands.
The lands remained lost. He had promised, implicitly or openly, that cost would become victory. Instead, cost became shame.
A messenger carrying the news into England would not need to explain the whole battlefield. The important thing could be said quickly enough.
The coalition had failed. Philip had won. The king's great effort had come to nothing. In a baronial hall, the reaction would not have been simple surprise. It would have been recognition. Men who had already distrusted John now possessed proof that their resentment had been justified. The money had not bought glory. It had bought another failure. This is the point where political anger changes character. Before Bouvin, John's barons could hate his methods while still fearing that he might succeed. Success would have forced them to reinterpret his pressure as harsh necessity. Victory in France might have restored enough prestige to make resistance more dangerous.
A king who wins can ask men to forget the pain of paying, but a king who loses after making them pay becomes vulnerable. Bouvin did not create every grievance against John.
Those grievances were older: Normandy, Arthur, taxation, arbitrary justice, debts, hostages, distrust, the church conflict, the king's habit of turning royal rights into personal pressure. But Bouvin removed the excuse that had held many grievances in suspension. The great project had failed. Now the barons could ask what they were enduring for.
Philip's victory also transformed the wider European balance. The French monarchy emerged stronger, more confident, more legitimate in the eyes of many contemporaries. The Capetian crown no longer looked like a fragile center surrounded by overmighty vassals. It looked like the authority around which France might be gathered. The Plantagenet world moved in the opposite direction. The Angevin continental structure, already broken by the loss of Normandy, now seemed beyond recovery in its old form. John could still hold lands in the southwest. He could still claim rights, maneuver diplomatically, and dream of reversal. But the great northern bridge, England to Normandy to Anjou, had been cut, and Bouvin made that cut feel permanent. The dream did not die in a single moment, but after Bouvin, fewer powerful men believed it was worth financing. That mattered more than any speech. Kingship depends on imagined futures.
Men obey not only because of what the king has done, but because of what they think he may yet do. A feared king may recover. A lucky king may rise. A victorious king may reward. But John after Bouvin looked like a ruler who could still punish failure in others without overcoming failure in himself. This was a dangerous image. Back in England, the fiscal machinery that had made his campaign possible remained in place. The debts did not vanish. The memories of exaction did not soften. The royal officials who had pressed men for money did not become beloved because the campaign failed. Instead, they became reminders of a system that had extracted obedience without delivering honor. The baronial opposition began to harden. The issue was no longer simply whether John had lost Normandy. It was whether a king who lost so much could still demand so much without restraint. The language of resistance would soon turn toward custom, law, liberties, and the limits of royal will. Men who had little interest in modern freedom would begin to speak as if the king himself had become the danger from which the realm needed protection. This was the road to Runnymede, and John helped pave it because he misunderstood the emotional meaning of defeat. He could see the practical need for money. He could understand the legal tools available to him. He could identify enemies, pressure debtors, punish opponents and exploit the machinery of kingship. What he could not restore was the trust that made such machinery tolerable. A king may survive being disliked. He cannot easily survive being disbelieved. After Bouvin, John's authority still existed, but it sounded different. A summons sounded like coercion. A payment sounded like punishment. A royal promise sounded temporary. A demand for loyalty sounded like a demand to share the consequences of his failure. The Angevin Empire had once seemed larger than the French king's reach. Under Henry II, it had wrapped around Capetian France like a threat. Under Richard, it had still looked dangerous behind stone walls and crusader fame. Under John, after Bouvin, the old grandeur became a memory. English barons were tired of funding. Philip had won more than a battle. He had made John's own kingdom question the price of being ruled by him. The next battlefield would not be in Flanders. It would not be in Normandy. It would not be along the Seine or in Poitou or before the walls of some fortress built to defend a lost inheritance. It would be beside the Thames, in a meadow called Runnymede, where swords would give way to parchment, and the King of England would discover that law could be used against him, too. The meadow did not look like a revolution. Runnymede was not a burning capital, not a conquered castle, not a battlefield soaked with the bodies of kings. It was a stretch of ground beside the Thames, open enough for negotiation, close enough to royal roads, ordinary enough to make the scene more disturbing. Because here, in June 1215, the King of England was forced to confront something more dangerous than a foreign army. His own political class had stopped believing him. John came to Runnymede not as a defeated prisoner, but as a ruler trapped by the consequences of his own reign. He still had a crown. He still had officials, castles, seals, sheriffs, courts, and the formal language of royal authority. But after Normandy, after Bouvin, after years of financial pressure and political mistrust, those instruments no longer sounded like order to many of his barons. They sounded like threat. Magna Carta was born from that sound. It is tempting to treat the Charter as the beginning of modern liberty, as if the men gathered near the Thames already imagined parliaments, constitutional monarchy, democratic citizenship, and universal rights. That would be too easy and too flattering. The rebel barons were not modern democrats. They were great men defending custom, privilege, property, inheritance, and their own survival against a king they believed had made royal power unbearable. But that does not make the moment small. Sometimes history changes because privileged men try to protect themselves and accidentally leave behind a language that later generations can use for larger purposes. By 1215, the anger against John had hardened into organization. The barons had taken London in May, a blow that changed the balance of the confrontation. London was not merely a city. It was wealth, legitimacy, pressure, and visibility. A king could ignore grumbling in distant halls. He could not easily ignore a rebellion that had entered the capital. The barons had demands. They wanted limits placed on the king's ability to exploit feudal rights. They wanted protection against arbitrary fines. They wanted rules around inheritance, wardship, debt, justice, and imprisonment. They wanted the king to stop treating custom as an obstacle and law as a tool belonging only to the crown. The irony was sharp. Henry II had strengthened royal law to restore order after the anarchy. Under John, royal law had come to feel like the king's weapon against the men who were supposed to uphold his rule. Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, stood near the center of this crisis. His role should not be reduced to a simple heroic invention of liberty, but he mattered. As archbishop, scholar, and political mediator, Langton helped give moral and legal shape to resistance. In a kingdom still marked by the memory of John's quarrel with the papacy, the presence of Canterbury carried weight. The Church could help turn baronial anger into something more formal than revenge. A rebellion needed a document. A document needed a language. And the language chosen was not revolution. It was restoration. The barons did not claim they were creating a new world. They claimed they were defending old liberties. This is how resistance often makes itself acceptable. It does not say, "We are inventing a limit on power." It says, "Power has violated the limits that already existed." That argument was useful because it allowed men to oppose the king while pretending, at least formally, to defend the proper order of kingship. John had become the disorder. At Runnymede, the charter that emerged was practical, dense, and rooted in the political world of its makers. It spoke of reliefs, widows, debts, courts, scutage, forests, merchants, weights and measures, inheritance, and lawful judgment. Its most famous later language, that no free man should be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, or destroyed, except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, would eventually acquire a life far beyond the immediate crisis. But in 1215, the meaning was narrower and sharper. The barons wanted the king's hand restrained. Imagine a scribe preparing the text. The scene is not grand in the way battle is grand. It is ink, parchment, pressure, and damp air near the river. A knife scrapes the surface smooth. A quill pauses before a clause that may anger the king. Wax waits to receive a seal. Men nearby speak in low tones, not because they are creating democracy, but because they are trying to force a dangerous ruler into written boundaries. The sound of law is quieter than war, but it can last longer. John agreed to the charter on June 15, 1215. More precisely, he placed his seal to it. Medieval kings did not sign documents in the modern sense. The distinction matters because the seal carried the authority of kingship. It made the text public, official, binding in form, even if John's heart never entered the agreement. And there lies the weakness. Magna Carta was a settlement made under pressure between men who did not trust one another. The barons did not trust John to keep it. John did not accept the charter as a moral transformation of kingship. To him, it was coercion, a humiliation, a temporary necessity forced upon him by rebels. This was not peace. It was a pause before the next violence. The charter included a security clause, later famous as Clause 61, which created a council of 25 barons with power to compel the king if he violated the agreement. To modernize, it can look like an early constitutional mechanism. To John, it must have looked like armed supervision. The king was being told that his own subjects could legally organize pressure against him if he failed to obey. For a medieval king raised in the world of lordship, honor, and command, this was more than limitation. It was an insult given legal form. John's response revealed how little had truly changed inside him.
He appealed to Pope Innocent III, who annulled the charter later in 1215, declaring it invalid because it had been forced from the king under duress. John, now a papal vassal after his earlier submission to Rome, used the papacy as protection against the very barons who had used church language and legal memory against him.
Again, the Angevin story turned on contradiction. A king who had once fought the church now used the pope to break a charter. A rebellion that claimed law soon returned to war. A document meant to end crisis helped expose how deep the crisis had become. The First Barons' War followed. The settlement at Runnymede collapsed almost as soon as it had been created. Rebel barons would eventually invite Prince Louis of France to take the English throne, an extraordinary act that showed just how far John's legitimacy had fallen. The King of England had become so mistrusted that some of his own leading subjects preferred a French prince to their anointed ruler. That was the true measure of the disaster. Not that John had enemies. All kings had enemies. The disaster was that his enemies could plausibly describe resistance as defense of the realm. Magna Carta did not save John's reign. It did not create immediate liberty for the common people. It did not end arbitrary power overnight. It did not prevent war. It did not even survive its first year in its original political form. And yet, it survived him. That is the strange power of 1215. A failed peace agreement born from aristocratic self-interest and royal humiliation became one of the most famous legal documents in world history. Later generations would reissue it, reinterpret it, mythologize it, and use it as a weapon in struggles its first makers could not have imagined. John wanted the charter destroyed as coercion. History kept the parchment. The deeper meaning of Runnymede is not that the barons were pure or that John alone invented tyranny. The deeper meaning is that the Angevin system had turned against itself. Henry II had built royal authority through law, administration, courts, and disciplined power. John inherited those tools and used them without the trust that had once made them politically survivable. The same instruments that had restored order after the anarchy now helped create the demand that royal power be written down, named, and restrained. This is how dynastic failure becomes institutional memory. A family loses Normandy. A king demands money. A coalition fails at Bouvines. A ruling class rebels. A meadow receives a charter, and centuries later, people remember the parchment more clearly than the lost empire that made it necessary. For the Angevin dream, Runnymede was not the beginning of recovery. It was the public admission that the old structure had broken. The empire Henry II had built from inheritance, marriage, law, and will had narrowed into an English kingship forced to negotiate with its own fear. John had spent years trying to recover lands in France. At Runnymede, he lost something closer to home. He lost the assumption that the king's will could be trusted simply because it was royal. The final chapter begins after that loss. With John's death, a child king, a kingdom still at war, and a charter that refused to disappear. The Angevin Empire was gone in its old form, but from its wreckage came a different legacy, colder and more enduring than Richard's glory or Henry's map. Not a castle, not a duchy, not a crusader legend, a limit written in ink. John did not die like the master of an empire. He died like a man chased by the consequences of one. In October 1216, with England torn by civil war, with rebel barons still in arms, with Prince Louis of France invited onto English soil by men who no longer trusted their own king, John moved through a kingdom that had become hostile to the sound of his name. The Angevin dream of Henry II had narrowed into a desperate fight for survival. The old map was gone. Normandy was gone. The confidence was gone. And soon, John was gone too. His death at Newark in 1216 did not end the crisis immediately. A king's death rarely repairs what his reign has broken. But it changed the emotional shape of the war. The hated adult ruler disappeared. In his place stood a child, Henry III, John's young son, not yet old enough to be blamed for the full weight of his father's failures. That mattered. A child king can become a political shelter. Men who could not forgive John could swear loyalty to Henry without feeling they had surrendered to the same enemy. The dynasty could continue because the person who embodied its immediate disgrace had been removed by death. It was a brutal kind of mercy. The regency around Henry III understood the opportunity. William Marshall, one of the most respected knights and political survivors of the age, became central to the defense of the young king's cause. He was old, experienced, and trusted in a way John had never been. Under the Regency, Magna Carta was reissued in 1216, not as a baronial weapon held against John, but as a tool to win support for Henry. This was one of the great ironies of the Angevin collapse. The charter John had resisted became useful to his son. A document born from rebellion could be repurposed as reconciliation. Clauses could be adjusted. The most radical security mechanism was removed. The language of restraint remained. The message was clear. This new reign would not simply continue John's methods. The child king's government would promise a different relationship between crown and political society. Whether from principle or necessity, it worked. Prince Louis, who had seemed for a moment like a serious alternative king of England, began to lose momentum. The Battle of Lincoln in 1217 helped turn the military tide. Later that year, a naval defeat off Sandwich weakened the French position further. Louis eventually accepted settlement and left England. The Plantagenet line survived, but it survived changed. The Angevin Empire of Henry II did not return. That is the key. There would be later Plantagenet ambitions in France. There would be later wars, later claims, later kings who dreamed across the Channel. But the old structure, England tied through Normandy to a vast northern and western continental inheritance, had been broken. The empire, as Henry had known it, no longer existed. What remained was something smaller, harder, and, in the long run, perhaps more consequential. An English monarchy forced to remember that royal authority had limits. A French monarchy strengthened by victory over its greatest rival. A legal document that began as crisis management and became historical memory. A dynasty that survived by abandoning the illusion that it could simply restore the world John had lost. Imagine, years later, a clerk copying the charter again. The room is quieter than a battlefield. There is no clash of cavalry, no siege engine, no royal army moving through mud. Only parchment, ink,
scraped skin, and a hand trained to preserve words, because words can become weapons long after the men who first used them are dead. The clerk may not think of Henry II's map. He may not think of Eleanor's marriage. He may not think of Richard's fortress above the Seine or John's humiliation at Runnymede.
But all of it is inside the document. The lost duchy, the failed campaign, the angry barons, the pressure of money, the fear that kingship, if left unwritten, could become unbearable. Magna Carta did not emerge from purity. It emerged from conflict. It did not give freedom to everyone. It protected a narrow political society first. It did not end royal power. It tried to discipline it. But because it named limits, because it placed royal will beside law, because it survived reissue and reinterpretation, it became larger than its first makers. John wanted to escape it. His successors learned to use it. Later generations would remember it in ways the barons of 1215 could not have imagined. It would become part of the long argument over law, monarchy, consent, and authority. The meaning changed because history kept returning to it with new fears. That is how political memory works. A document written for one crisis becomes language for another. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Philip II's victory reshaped France. The Capetian monarchy emerged stronger, not because it destroyed every rival overnight, but because it had broken the greatest overmighty vassal in the kingdom. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, lands that had once made the French king look small, moved into a new orbit. The crown in Paris gained territory, prestige, and administrative confidence. Henry II had once surrounded Capetian France like a threat. By the time John died, that threat had been cut apart. The transformation was not only territorial, it was psychological. The French monarchy had proven that patience, law, siege warfare, and political exploitation could defeat a dynastic giant. Philip II did not need Richard's legend. He needed the Angevin family to fracture, John to lose trust, and the machinery of feudal obligation to be turned against the very lords who had once seemed too powerful to control. The French crown learned from Angevin weakness. England learned from Angevin overreach, and the Plantagenets learned, slowly and painfully, that a family inheritance was not the same as a state. That is the central lesson of the Angevin Empire. It rose because one family gathered too much, too quickly, through marriage, blood, law, and force. Henry II was brilliant enough to make the arrangement function while he lived. Eleanor's lands gave it scale. Richard's military aura defended it for a generation. But the structure had no single heart strong enough to beat after trust failed. It was held together by people. And people die. They quarrel. They inherit badly. They mistrust brothers. They resent fathers. They disappear nephews. They tax allies. They lose battles. They turn necessity into anger. The tragedy is not that the Angevin Empire collapsed from one blow. It is that every tool used to build it contained a future fracture. Marriage brought territory, but also competing claims. Law brought authority, but also legal vulnerability. Castles brought defense, but also expense. Sons brought continuity, but also rivalry. England brought money, but also resistance when money funded failure. The system was magnificent. It was also unstable by design. This does not make Henry II a fool. It makes him more interesting than a simple conqueror. He saw disorder clearly. He understood that weak kingship could destroy a realm. He built law where war had left wounds. He restored royal presence where civil conflict had loosened obedience. He made England stronger. And from that strength, he projected authority across a world no English king had ever commanded. But Henry's success depended on an assumption he could never guarantee: that the family would remain governable. It did not. Eleanor became more than a bridge. She became a reminder that Aquitaine had its own identity.
The young king turned ceremonial honor into grievance. Richard turned glory into cost. John turned inheritance into isolation. Philip turned feudal law into a weapon. The barons turned old custom into written resistance. By the end, the empire that had once seemed to control Europe had produced two futures that outlived it.
In France, a stronger monarchy. In England, a more contested kingship. That is why the Angevin story matters. Not because it was a formal empire in the Roman sense. It was not. Not because it offered a clean national origin story. It does not. Not because its rulers were heroes or villains arranged neatly for moral judgment. They were more dangerous than that. Intelligent, ambitious, afraid, capable, wounded, and trapped inside a system that rewarded expansion before punishing its consequences. Return to the opening image. The map under candlelight. England in one color. Normandy in the same. Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Aquitaine stretching south. A family name spread across parchment, as if parchment could make loyalty simple. Now look closer. At the Channel, where ships carry orders and resentment. At Normandy, where a fortress waits for relief that does not come. At Aquitaine, where local pride does not vanish beneath a marriage. At England, where sheriffs collect money for wars many men no longer believe in. At Runnymede, where a king's seal presses into parchment because trust has failed. The map was never only a map, it was a promise. And the promise was too large for the family that made it. The Angevin Empire did not disappear without leaving traces. It left stronger royal administration in England. It left legal memory. It left baronial suspicion. It left French royal expansion. It left the Plantagenet hunger for continental recovery, a hunger that would echo for generations. It left stories of Henry's rage, Eleanor's endurance, Richard's glory, John's disgrace, Philip's patience, and a charter whose afterlife became larger than its birth. But most of all, it left a warning. A realm can be assembled faster than it can be integrated. A family can inherit more than it can govern. A ruler can mistake possession for unity. And when the hidden cost finally appears, it does not always arrive as an enemy at the gate. Sometimes it arrives as a son demanding his share. A vassal summoned to court, a fortress waiting in vain, a baron refusing to pay, a parchment laid beside a river. If this story tells us anything, it is that power does not fail only when it grows weak. Sometimes it fails after becoming too large for the trust, law, money, and blood that hold it together. The Angevin Empire controlled half a political world. Then it discovered that the most dangerous frontier was inside itself. If you want the next chapter in this dark history series, tell us which dynasty or empire should face the judgment of history next. And subscribe for more stories where crowns, wars, faith, law, and betrayal are not treated as legends, but as systems that once ruled real human lives. Because history is not only the record of what kings possessed, it is the autopsy of what they could not keep.